course, thank you, John and Jill, for having this amazing class. It seems like the whole semester has been really dynamic, and I'm sorry this is the first time I'm showing up for it when I'm on the program on the stage, and it's great to be sharing the stage with you, Shawn. We arrived around the same time, and just by a way of introduction, I guess I will say I am the Curator of Modern Contemporary Art at the VMFA, and I've been here since July, but in earnest since September, because I started late August is when I really felt my feet got planted on the ground. And prior to being here, I was in Houston for 16 plus years, almost 17 years, with the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, which functions as a non-collecting museum. It's one of the oldest non-collecting museums dedicated to contemporary art. It was founded in 1948. So I'm from Houston, so to be able to go back to Houston in that capacity was really quite extraordinary. Prior to that, I was in Chicago with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and I ran the Visiting Artist program there, which was sort of my own symposium, my seminar room, the auditorium, where I got to meet really amazing artists working in the field. And prior to that, I was in Washington, D.C. with the National Endowment for the Arts, where I was a program specialist. So I've had many different lives within this life, but all committed to the arts and yeah, various roles. So, and now, Shawn, would you like to introduce yourself?
A bit about myself. I'm Dean of the School of the Arts here at VCU. I have another title also. I'm Special Assistant to the Provost for the School of the Arts in Qatar. I'm also an affiliate faculty member in engineering here at VCU. I have spent the last 30 years in academia as a professor, but 27 of those years in the executive or in leadership. Now that doesn't mean that I didn't teach. What it really means is that, like most of us, we wear multiple hats. Mm-hmm. I was trained primarily early on in sculpture and experimental media, and universities find out that once you have teams of people, that your own research practice is a fractal of how you run organizations, universities, and budgets. They have a tendency to tap you to help them move the organization along. So I've had a very long career. Before I arrived here, I was dean of the largest art school in North America in Toronto, Canada, and it's called the School of the Arts, Media, Performance, and Design. 5,000 plus students, 500 doctoral students, 2 national laboratories, 500,000 square feet, a very, very, very big place. Before that, I was the founder of a new school called VCUarts at the University of Washington. And it's a new art school, a new kind of art school, hybrid art school, that splits between art design, engineering, computer science, comparative history of ideas, literature, etc. So it's truly an art school of absolute total hybrids. And before that, I was the founder of the Center for New Media at UC Berkeley. I could kind of go on for a while because after doing this for 30 years, I've been a lot of places. So I've either founded schools or I've inherited them. Mm-hmm. And I would probably say one unique fact tonight that will be apparent in my work and probably in the way in which I think and talk to Valerie about who I am and what I do, is I'm the only dean of an art school in North America who's actually trained as a scientist and engineer at MIT. And so as I said earlier to one of the students, that the art that I wanted to make in art school was impossible, so I had to actually leave and become a scientist engineer bona fide to make the art that I wanted to make. And then I somewhat jokingly and blithely said that I've spent the last angry 30 years coming back to the very best art schools in North America and transforming them so that students, in effect, not could become me, but in effect become the world's leading expert in their own creative area of practice. Mm-hmm. And I think in many ways we both share sort of a common goal on allowing our institutions to become transformational institutions, for institutions to become learning communities, right? And that's a place that I think that we clearly share. So that's probably an acceptable introduction.
Well, it's wonderful. We were, as John jokingly said, we were down in the coffee shop, which was the informal green room for the depot, and but we were chatting, Shawn and I, and to just that end of what you were saying about the improbability of our work when we first started in these fields, and how through just sheer curiosity, a persistence of wanting, longing, needing to see one's interests and passions reflected, we have bit by bit been a part of that whole transformational wave that's come through these institutions, and now we are on the forefront of creating these platforms and opportunities for subsequent generations. So, I mean, how amazing is that? So I would love to hear about that improbability when you first started, when you were at Kansas City Art Institute. We haven't gotten to the slides yet, but
just press the side button. Oh, that's easy.
Oh, well, yes.
So most of you who've read anything about me in the media, you'll often hear stories that my parents were producers for the Grand Ole Opry. And the country western stars needed crossover a format for their pop chart songs. So my parents were moved to Springfield, Missouri to create what was called the Jubilee. And those of you who are, have a little bit of seniority will know that TV show is much beloved. So I grew up with Patsy Cline and Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley. But it was in the days of like a 3-camera video shoot, analog synthesizer. But when you're a small child and your parents are doing that, I actually thought that my parents teleported people. I didn't think they had anything to do with television at all. I just noticed that people are here, and 1,000 miles away they were there, and that could be 10,000 miles or 1,000,000 miles away, though they would be much smaller, like they were just sort of subdivided into little versions of that. And so, like a lot of you, there are turning points where you have a parent or an uncle or a grandparent who says, you seem to have some skill, and they get you like a drawing set, or they have you make objects, right? You don't have your own agency fully yet. The turning points are really being guided by you. So my parents had me work very hard at being able to copy European masters. So by the time I got to art school in Kansas City, and that's the Nelson Atkins Museum, and that's Stephen Hull's building, right? So when you start seeing the threads that we draw, they're very tight. The community is not as big as it looks. There's a lot of overlap. But by the time I got to art school, I could draw very, very well, like a European master, although I had been a young kid in an atelier, right? So, but most of us who are artists in the room know that you don't draw from here, you draw from here, right? So it's a very different place. And to learn to draw from that different place requires very different things. So what they did in Kansas City, and I'll finish up my story and then I'll ask Valerie some questions. And this is the transformational moment. There were usually about 10 kids, maybe 8, who were, I would say, problem students. We were problem to the point of where we weren't bad at grades. In fact, we were typically exceptional, but we didn't really, we spent too much time psychoanalyzing our faculty or trying to get underneath what it is that you really meant you were talking about, et cetera. We were trying to get to something. So they had a solution. They would put you in a yellow school bus. They would drive you 200 miles into western Kansas. They would give you an art bin box full of supplies and enough food to last for 12 to 15 hours and a 5-gallon jug of water. And then they would say, if you want to be a painter, make a perfect line. If you want to be a sculptor, make a perfect moment. We'll come back in 6 to 12 hours and you're all by yourself, right? Wow. There's snakes out there, et cetera. You're in an absolute wilderness, and we'll critique your work, and you will either stay in art school or we will summarily dismiss you. So like any good art student, I was running on fumes, and the first thing I did was take a nap because you're really tired. But I woke up in a panic after maybe 6 hours, terribly sunburned on one side of my face. I'd done nothing, had completed nothing, and this, sort of thing on my shoulder was saying, you must do something. So I dug a hole in the ground. They give you an army shovel, a small army shovel. And I took my water, which I had not taken any drink out of, and I cut the lid off of it. I took a piece of wheat chaff about 4 inches long, split it open and made a raft, took a needle out of my art bin box, which you use to sew stuff, and magnets to pick up your push pins, and I magnetized it and I laid it on top of the raft. What did I do? I made a compass. Now, if you think about this, and you know anything about basic science and about Faraday lines, what I actually did with a compass is I drew a line around the globe. I circumscribed the globe with unerring accuracy, absolute total perfection. Remember, make a perfect line. 24,000 miles. But simultaneously, all Faraday lines project all future lines, so it wasn't just one line. I had projected all potential future perfect lines simultaneously. Now, if you think about the sculpture side of it, you actually know that the Earth, its magnetic field is a tensor field, right? Which means it's always in a state of becoming. It never is. So it is ultimately a perfect moment. Now, I hadn't thought through all of this. I just impulsively made this thing, right? But the teachers roll up in the bus. Everybody gets out. They stare into the hole. And they think I had pulled the sword from the stone, right? And I had somehow, been hit by a God ray. And I was a genius, and of course I wasn't. I was just a farm kid whose parents were TV producers. And as we drove back, I remember thinking to myself, what just happened? Do I want to wait for the caprice of this to occur, right? Or do I want to build a philosophy? Do I want to build a practice? Do I want to understand, right? And so these turning points that somebody gives you a pencil, or they encourage you to take a class in music, they encourage you to do something. At what point do you take over, right, and take responsibility to developing that? And so those are, that's a perfect example from sort of many stories that, I could probably share with you.
Wow.
Similarly, sort of as a segue, with Valerie, as we were talking downstairs, I said that when I started as a young engineer at MIT, I was blessed with a private language of mathematics for us to work with, and then I had curated bodies of knowledge, which are basically special societies and journals for us to look at that are just our bodies of knowledge. And I thought to myself that, young artists, young engineers, you have to compete with cats on YouTube playing piano. You don't live in a world of curated knowledge the way in which we think. And so I wanted to ask Valerie, what is the improbable path, right, that takes a young person into a place of being curious, right, and then into including that curiosity into a practice and a process that leads you to a career like yours?
Well, you talk about bodies of knowledge, and I think about the knowledge that exists within bodies, embodied experiences. And I think what really drove me, I didn't start off my life thinking I wanted to be a curator. In fact, I didn't know what a curator was. I wasn't raised in an environment where museums or museum going or, those things museums were things we were bused to in primary school. It was a field trip, and the works hung on the wall, and those works, for me as a young black body walking through those halls, were not reflected of me. I didn't see myself reflected in them. And so it was a long and circuitous route. I initially studied communications and journalism at UT Austin. So that gave me the platform for asking the questions. Wanting to provide frameworks for which people could ask questions and ways in which people could come in to not necessarily answering a question, but providing perspectives on queries. I never really wanted to know the answers. I always felt like everyone has a bit of the piece of the truth. It's like the Tower of Babel, Everyone's got a piece of the truth, but when you pull all those things together, I don't think you still even know the truth. It's so fractured and distorted. So for me, the interests were, how do you create platforms to see oneself reflected? how do you get to showing those bodies of knowledge within the white cube, within the white box? So jumping from studying journalism into the visual arts was, I think far too long a narrative, but I started off doing arts administration, which brought me into the National Endowment for the Arts, which after the whole, debacle and debate around public support and public funding, and when and where money should go to support the arts and which kinds of arts are supported. Once that took place and the agency was sort of used as a political football in the 1990s.
God bless you.
Yes, God bless you. Then I was part of the bathwater of the funding cuts that came to the National Endowment for the Arts, which got me to Chicago, which I started at the School of the Art Institute, again, running the Visiting Artists program. And from there was asked by Max Anderson, who had then taken over the Whitney Museum of American Art, to be one of several individuals coming to organize the 2000 Whitney Biennial. I never really thought of my work as being curatorial in scope. I never came to it with the headspace of that. So it was from there that I began to think, so this is what a curator does. I really wasn't quite, my head wasn't around it. So by the time 2000 rolls around, I really can begin to understand what language means when it comes to certain frameworks of working, so curating. And that brings me to the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, which is an opportunity to go back to Houston to do work. So things like Cinema Remixed and Reloaded or Donald Moffat, those were the types of projects because the museum functioned as a Kunsthalle. It was a non-collecting institution. You could pose questions to artists and you could get those queries responded to with a collection of works in a space. And they could provide, in group exhibitions, multiple portals in which people could sometimes see themselves reflected, whether it was in the practice that an artist placed forward or the content of the work that they presented. So cinema, I love this sort of concept of hiding in plain sight. I love the idea that when you think of the evolution of the moving image in the white cube, in the museum, or within the gallery space, the first people you think of are male, white male. You never think of black and female. However, that history and that arc of history of black women working with the moving image from the very inception of the moving image being absorbed into museums as legitimate frameworks and languages of art has been there. It's been a constant. So to be able to do Cinema Remixed and Reloaded, it's a project I did with Dr. Andrea Barnwell Brownlee, who was director and is director of the Spelman Museum of Fine Art. So to do that with an institution whose mission is all about uplifting black women within the arts, within the context of the arts, was an extraordinary thing. And then to work with someone like Donald Moffat, who was a part of ACT UP and Grand Fury, and to present him with 20 years survey of work to show the various movements of his work over time. To work with this project, which is called Black in the Abstract, looking at the history and intergenerationally the history of black artists working in abstraction. These are the types of projects that I was interested in finding because they were queries. Where are black artists working in abstraction? Where do you see them? How can you provide people with a framework for understanding that a history is not new, which is what they expect in a contemporary arts museum, right? They expect the now, the moment, right now. But it is important when you look at the nascent frameworks of understanding black artists and black art history that you have to provide the arc to understanding artists of the now do not come out of a vacuum. that there is a whole trajectory that they're a part of. And so doing something like a 2-part exhibition, which includes Sam Gilliam and Belrath Hines, who was a conservator at the Hirshhorn, who was an amazing painter, Alma Thomas. I didn't go as far back as Delilah Pierce, who was in Washington, D.C., but I tried to at least start with the 1960s, at least the late 1960s, because it becomes, in many ways, for people working in contemporary art, this sort of bedrock for how artists work today. You know, we could trace it even further back, but I, for purposes, you know, cutoff purposes, just start with the 1960s. So this intersection between art and technology, again, you know, we had this moment where we were talking about fluxus and your work with Charlotte Moorman, and just the intersections beginning with the 1960s. I mean, the whole framework of understanding technology and science and art, the combination of those, the cross-disciplinary moments in which artists come together and work, again, are not new. They have histories that go far back as technologies that are applied really out of war, when you think about it, and how the war and technologies developed for warfare are often in the aftermath used to make these amazing leaps. And the first person that they give this technology to is to artists. So it's interesting. Do you want to talk about this project that you?
Yeah, or the first thing that happens is a hostile takeover.
Or a hostile takeover by
or
artists.
the virus that assumes the host. So I mean, you've given me a really such an incredible horizon to stand on. So we could both probably effectively trace what we're talking back to Diogenes if we wanted to. We could both walk that line. I've often taken my students to contemporary museums in any city, and I say, point out a 20th century object. I'll tell you who their teacher was, who their teacher was, who their teacher was, and I'll draw a line to me. Not because I'm famous, but simply all of you, right? Every one of you in the room who are studying in this institution, right? It is not, those arcs are very easy to map out. Now, one of the interesting things for me in my practice is that when I went to MIT and studied science, I began to no longer be an artist who was, let's say, a sophisticated user of technology. I began to have the capacity to develop it, which is different than inheriting it, right, from another vehicle, whether it was a military vehicle, an entertainment vehicle, et cetera. And at MIT, not unlike anyone who's doing a dissertation, if you want to discover new knowledge, right? Because that's part of our goal here, is to discover new knowledge and document it in ways that we had never imagined. You have to ask yourself, especially as a student, some pretty big questions. And so one of the questions that I was toying with was that the notion that humans are not just 100-year biological vessels, right? We're million-year creatures embedded in a billion-year process. And if I was going to be an artist, right, almost like a primitive artist, like in the caves of Lascaux, right, or Altamira, if I was going to leave a mark in a space that maybe might be discovered 1,000,000 years hence, 100 million years hence, right, not because of arrogance, but really to embrace this. If I took a picture of Valerie with the most famous photographer in the world, right? We can choose anyone we want. Annie Leibovitz, Richard Avedon, it doesn't matter. There are many others. But if we put it under an electron microscope, we would slowly see that she would disappear. And there would only be the materials left, right? And I began thinking about what Jack Burnham called system aesthetic. And system aesthetic for him was different. But for me, is what would it be like if an artist actually was responsible poetically, artistically, technically, to the very smallest quantum that you can reach, that we know of, right? Absolutely down to the very largest scale in the universe. And not independently, but all in a single Gesamtkunstwerk, right? In a single piece. So the piece that I'm showing you right now is called Instruments of Material Poetry. It was originally designed for the Mitsukoshi Museum in Japan. And if you train your eyes to the right, and you think about the title, it's an instrument that makes matter poems. The object itself is not the art. The sort of device on the right side is actually a light source. And that light source has an amplitude modulated signal that's being run through the light, so a little like a radio station. And for imagining purposes, most people, you don't think of light as weighing anything. It doesn't. But when it strikes an object, it actually gives over its kinetic momentum to anything that it touches. So if we went out to the desert, you and I, and we had two giant aluminum gloves that were 1 square mile, and we tried to measure how much light pressure there was on the earth, how much do you think that would weigh, 1 square mile? About 6 pounds, right? Not much. But it keeps the sun from imploding on itself because the radiation pressure keeps it from collapsing. So what I've done here is I've created a light source that is so powerful, 50 million candle power. I've encoded my voice into the light, and it goes into a sphere in the middle that has a pure vacuum. There is no air in there. It's 4 times 10 to the negative 4th torr. Better than you'd find if you took it into outer space on the space station, grabbed some vacuum and brought it back.
Wow.
Then the drawings that I take, that I drew all of the instrument of, are inside. And I use a piezoelectric transducer that breaks the van der Waals force, which are all of the sort of the forces that keep molecules together. And then they're blown up and into a cloud. And that cloud then is slammed into by the light, which is my voice, which has become stronger than the local field of gravity. My voice is now 3 times stronger than gravity. Each particle starts to spin exactly the way that a planet does. They form a flat oblate disk the exact same way that a solar system does or a galaxy does. And the reflected light spins like a beacon of my voice. And the detectors on the left-hand side convert that light into electricity in an eccentric choir of millions of voices. So my work of art here is just the interaction of electrons, of photons with electrons and matter. Now you can go much smaller than this, but this is sort of the first foray right into this. So you can start to see what I'm saying. I'm making work that is a resonant reflective moment for being a physical being now. I live now. The older I get, we both are parents, and we were talking earlier, when you become parents, like the older I get, like the more the hair stands up on the back of my neck, the more animal I am, the more I love being in my body, right? So I'm not abandoning us, but I am challenging us to understand that even the white cube, right? It may not be there in 1,000,000 years hence. So I'm creating work that resides actually in the fabric of space-time, not out of arrogance, but because I love us, I believe in us. And those marks will be there forever and ever and ever. I will show you another project or two in a minute as we get through Valerie's. But I won't show you my dissertation at MIT, which actually did something that no one had ever done before, which would allow basically coherent, it basically allows for coherent photons to do some kind of special relationship that would allow sort of the artwork to be valid for all inertial frames of reference. If I was a physicist in front of you and you were in a physics class, I would write out a formula. How would you make a work of art that was valid for all inertial frames of reference? And that breaks down to effectively, how would you create a work of art that mathematically and experimentally can be tested, that is both the center of the universe and will last forever and ever and ever, right? So you can actually do this mathematically. You can do this experimentally and not out of arrogance. Again, it's about humans, right? You went into the space. You didn't feel yourself there, but you sensed something else. And for me, I go into the space of who we are and what we're capable of and find, how do I reach that space? This is a time-lapsed photo of about 1/4 of a second. And this is an unusual, I think that's maybe a laser. Is that a laser? No. Anyway, if you can cross your eyes, that's a 3D image. This is a binary system, exactly like what you find in deep space. Each particle spins at a certain spin rate. I could go through a bunch of science, but what you find is that I'm basically creating the exact same structures that you find in deep space at a very accelerated pace, following many of the patterns that you see in nature. So as we talk about this, and we talk about being seen, right? And the desire to be seen and to be felt, right? And then where do we reach? Do we do it in our communities? Do we do it on ourselves? Do we do it by reaching, to the moon, right? and leaving a footprint? Is that arrogance? Is that gentrification? Is that us taking something away that should be sacred?
Well, I love this notion that oftentimes we think of math and science as being, quantifiable, tangible. Yet there's this wonderful esoteric aspect of science. When you get into physics, you talked about meeting John Cage and Charlotte Moorman. I mean, these are people, individuals, it was a moment, a groundswell, I feel, with Fluxus and the sort of constellation of artists who were coming from all these different fields. But they understood the notion, all of them very highly trained, but understanding that art could happen in the most minute movement of an arm, of spectacle, as music, as a cacophony of voices. But I love this notion that we are dealing with something that, especially in the work, where you're bringing science and math back into a very esoteric and almost mystical space. When we think of sunlight beaming down on our faces, it's hard to understand that the light we're feeling has left the sun not millions, but hundreds of years before.
8 minutes and 22 seconds from the surface, but 10 million years from the center to the edge.
Exactly. So, I mean, when you think about that we live that these small things that we experience every day are so far removed from our physical selves in this moment. If we try to align those time frames of beginnings and endings, they are along this crazy spectrum that we cannot, I mean, I'm listening to you speak, and all I'm thinking of is the esoteric nature being brought down to a very small spectacle, that it's so grand that you could collapse it down to this one, in that one small unit that you created, was this whole chain reaction that we take for granted, these small little things, like the voice being projected, and knowing that it will radiate forward into time and space that we cannot quite comprehend in this moment.
So Mars is real, right? Can we all agree on that? But it is so far removed from operational awareness that it is imaginary. Right. Each one of you have genes in your body right now encoding proteins, but you have no operational awareness of that. And when Valerie walked into the museum as a young girl, right? You understand what I mean?
Right.
And felt something but did not feel something, that space was so far that it was an imaginary space, but you spend your entire life, right, first trying to discover it, right, and then your entire life really not just allowing, but supporting others who want to find their spaces that may touch our spaces. So one of the things I'm most fascinated with your work especially is that because in the curatorial side, you make a connection between craft and performance, right? The performative, because clearly, you're sort of seeing us up here, and I can immediately, I can start to see these patterns emerging that I get very excited about, and knowing that the somatic awareness is very different than the somatic fidelity that occurs in an object and how you perform that object. We have children, and we both know that kids perform their drawings. Right. It includes coffee cups and dinosaurs and loud noises and big scribbles and small movements, sound effects. So maybe as we work through some of your slides, can you talk a little bit about where the performative started to arrive for you, or was it always there and then it got reflected sort of in a different way?
Well, I mean, it is there. I mean, I think for artists to create, there has to be some physical manifestation between the thought that happens here, moving through the body, whether it's the hand, the arms, the legs, whatever they create with, onto an object. But oftentimes people do see the body as both tool and object, presenter. So that all-encompassing thing has been of great interest to me, because we started this conversation by saying there's this sort of embodiment of experiences. Those things are very interesting to me. You can't live in a black body and not understand, particularly in this day and age, where that could be for some people a death sentence, just being in a black or brown or othered body. If you knock on a door, you never know what you're going to get. But with someone like Howardina Pindell, which is a project which is currently on view at the MCA Chicago and will come here to Richmond in August, at the end of August. I think what's interesting about Howardina, she started her career always as a painter. From a very young age, she knew she wanted to be an artist. Even being born in 1943 and not seeing oneself reflected, she was already very committed to seeing the image of self-reflected. Her father was a mathematician. How interesting is that? And that is also carried over into the work. Her very amateur but very passionate interest in astronomy is also embedded into her work. And performance. Understanding her own body as performative in many ways. The labor and her art really exists to show the intensity of labor within the creation of an object. So what we'll see when the exhibition comes, a lot of works on paper, canvases which move from the stretcher to free-flowing canvases that are unstretched, that are literally stitched together, and then accumulation of surfaces. So there is this performative element, even in the creation, where labor and time and the accumulation onto the surface is key in her work. It's very interesting, and you do see these long arcs of practices, how they evolve over time, from small chads being affixed flat to the surface of a paper to the 2000s, some 30, 40 years later, because this exhibition encompasses 50 years of work, where those chads are literally standing upright. So how an artist evolves in their practice is really interesting, and she's quite amazing in that way. This project, Hand Plus Made, which was presented at the Contemporary Arts Museum in 2010, was really looking at artists who had been formally trained in craft. So metal smithing, fiber and material studies, glass blowing, woodworking, the whole 9 yards. Nick Cave, who you spoke to, was also another Kansas City Art Institute grad who studied with Alvin Ailey, who then, and you were saying a wonderful...
I was one of his first models for his first major fashion show.
There you have it. There you have it, right here. You heard it here. It's amazing, but you see these things that are static. But for me, how to create that sense of dynamism within the white cube. You know, oftentimes when exhibitions about performance art are often presented, they're the static. They are the remnants, they are the residuals, they are the photo or video documentation of actions which have taken place. Well, for me, I really wanted the museum to be alive. I really wanted people to understand the full magnitude of these objects in motion. So whereas you see this very static, behind it was a projection of these works in motion and other creations in motion. And it was probably one of the few artworks by artists in Leshu in the exhibition that were fairly static, where you did see documentation. Everything else, we allowed the artists to have some sort of dynamic presence in the space. Within and outside of this space, we had Gabriel Craig, who would set up his jewelry cart, and he would without permits, just show up on the sidewalks of places and talk to people and engage them in conversations.
Was the Astor Gates in this show?
The Astor Gates was in the exhibition.
I'm trying to remember all the people in the show, yeah.
And he came, and his Journeyman of Christ, we paired him with a local ensemble called the Journeyman of Christ, and he actually talked about creating this libretto around Dave the Potter, who was a slave who created these amazing pots, of which the VMFA has just acquired one. So Cynthia Giachetti, who came and created these beautiful installation of ceramic flowers, who ritualistically gave those flowers to audience members. Ann Wilson, who did a piece called Walking the Warp, in which the loom was laid flat. Yeah. And we trained dancers. She came in and trained dancers to actually come in and walk the warp, literally create work using the loom that she then laid flat rather than sitting upright. So there was a lot of elements, and this spilled over to 2 years later of me wanting to really investigate Black artists and the realm of performance art. Again, not seeing oneself reflected in this very venerable, pillar of contemporary art, which is this performance artwork. It's like, where are the forebears? We know some of the younger artists, we may know people like Adrian Piper, David Hammonds, but beyond that, where are the progenitors? Where are the people where is the bedrock? Where are the heroes and the heroines of this whole generation who are now engaged in performance? So again, very intergenerational. This is Terry Atkins, who unfortunately we lost in 2014, who is performing his last trumpet at the space. And you see just beyond him is a grid on the floor, and that was Benjamin Patterson's 1962 piece called Pond, in which people would sit at different quadrants of that square. And it was a poem, it was a score for action. So you had basically 8 people, 2 people on each side of that square, and they would basically take these mechanical toy frogs and sit them on the ground, and based on where they fell in a quadrant, he had A, Q, E, which was answer, question, exclamation. And so it was a 2-word answer, it was a 3-word question, and a 1-word exclamation. So wherever these frogs would fall, and then he did them in intervals, 0 to 10 seconds, 10 to 20 seconds, all within these spaces. So depending on when you started, by the time it got to the 8th person and this frog, between the on the floor and the hello, 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 who are you? Who are you? Who are you? I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. With all of these voices, it became this amazing cacophony of sound. And you realize the music, the words meant nothing anymore. They became these abstractions. They became vehicles just to create sound. And it was really extraordinary. Speaking of infinite.
So as I'm listening to Valerie, right, and maybe you're picking up on this, it's not a trend, right? There's been a long-held assumption that all of the performance and the time, let's say in a monastic practice like painting, occurs independent, right, of the work, and then it's taken out in sort of in a different state, and it arrives. It's intrinsic to it, but it's not live. It's fixed, right? But much of what she's talking about is not just simply the history of 20th century practice, but this desire for a kind of bidirectionality, right? That it's not just simply engaging an audience through entertainment, it's a very different kind. And even, the last piece that you talk about, the sort of call and response nature, right? The way in which all these animating forces, bring humans into contact with one another. And so as I, many projects later after the one that I showed you, I began, thinking not just about what it's like for a human to leave a trace, right?
because in craft you can think of, a trace on a vessel. There's so many places that we can trace our traces, right? We can walk them back. And it's so important for that human signature, regardless of how it occurs and where it occurs. But rather than just inserting myself into a space and sort of exclaiming, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, and you will discover it, I began thinking, what would it be like to make a work of art for who we were, who we are, and who we will become? And to take not just the very small to the scale that we're at, but to take the very small to the very where we're at, to the very large, all simultaneously. Now, that required some analysis of how one would ever approach that. I mean, there are lots of sculptures you can imagine. You can look at a lot of failed concepts. You can look at the architecture of Albert Speer, and his light cathedrals, which drove the sort of Nazi imagination, all of these things. Some that went terribly wrong, some that went terribly right. So I began in a very different place. How many of you, when you were kids, remember pressing your hands on your eyes? And when you press long enough and hard enough, you actually begin to see patterns of light. They're exquisite. They have colors, they have repeating sort of shapes and patterns. Well, those are called phosphenes. And what they are is they're sodium and potassium ions. They cascade down the optic nerve. Certain part of the brain processes what's called stochastic noise. It doesn't know what to do with it because it's not really light, but it can only interpret it as such. If you go back historically far enough, you can actually find that Benjamin Franklin had phosphene parties, probably in a state like Virginia. You used an electrostatic generator, which is a piece of glass and catgut. You'd spin it really fast, and Valerie and I would touch our naked hands with one another and everyone else, and then we would let go, and we would make and break a circuit over and over, and we would get flashes of light in our eyes in the dark. Now, this was sort of, slightly psychosexual in those days. So that was like foreplay to some, a kind of a, cultural foreplay. But if you look at Purkinje was an early neuroscientist. If you look at Alexander Volta, and if you think of Volta, chop off the A, Volt, right? He was one of the very early scientists working with electricity. So he studied it too, but with copper beads. And so I thought to myself, if this is so old, right, it's actually a part of our biology. Is there something that I can go beyond having intellectual communion with you, but I can actually have communion with us and everything else? Is there a place for that other than outside of, the spiritual environment of our relationship potentially with God or whatever force you believe in? So I looked for years for something that I could have communion with, right, in this particular way, and I was almost defeated. But artists and curators, we don't give up.
No.
I was walking down the hall at MIT many years later after I graduated, and normally astronomers look at spreadsheets, lots and lots of data, and we use lots of numbers to crunch data. Well, the interesting thing that would happen on this day is MIT has what's called the infinite corridor, and they have chalkboards that are a quarter of a mile long, and they are sacred. You do not touch them, because someone is actually working on something that may change the course of history. Well, someone had actually translated some of that data into analog waveforms. And as I was walking down the infinite corridor and passing it almost like an animation, right? All of a sudden, I began to understand something. I'm getting goosebumps now, and I don't get that very often simply because at a certain point, you've seen a lot of stuff, and it takes a lot to get you excited. And I realized, oh my God, that's a pulsar. Pulsars are big stars that when they die, they collapse, and then they spin violently around a very strong magnetic field, and they release a beacon of energy at a very particular period and signature inside of that. And it dawned on me that that exact same wave pattern was the exact same pattern that's used, the alpha and the beta wave function in the brain to stimulate the phosphenes. So I didn't have a cell phone, they didn't exist. I called friends on an old landline, and I asked my friends at Haystack, which is the very large telescope, the radio telescope in Massachusetts, part of MIT, and I said, please send me a recording of the Crab Nebula, which has a certain frequency, right? Pulse period, and a signature inside of that. I built a device fairly crude, but it looked a lot like an early cell phone. And instead of a jack for your headphones, it actually used 2 galvanic electrodes here and here on the occiput and on your temples. And when you play back the recording of a star from 25 to 100 million years ago, this is what the brain sees.
Wow. Wow.
It's a work of art that can only exist in the mind's eye of the viewer. This is a computer model. It's very accurate. And now this is not a still image, because what I would normally be showing you is a video of that. So you are having communion, right, with who we were, who we are, and who we will become. It's a work of art. It's a performance work that's actually 25 million years, not just in terms of its linear scale, but its scalar scale, all the way into our evolutionary neurobiology to the beginning of the beginning, before we were even who we are, right? That the brain immediately understands and recognizes it. It needs no fancy apparatus, no conversion. There was a book written and then a journal entry by a gentleman named Max Knoll in 1931. If anybody reads Deutsch, German, you can read it in the Zeitschrift for Psychology in 1931. And he theorized that when you were in the womb, the pressure from your mother's belly, the amniotic fluid, actually pressed on your eyes, produced phosphines. So even while you were learning to hear, you were also learning to see. And the patterns that are reproduced are very systematic. And he actually believed many of our proclivities towards combinations of threes or certain kinds of patterns that occur everywhere are simply programmed into our evolutionary neurobiology. And so I began, really starting to understand my practice here in terms of taking, ownership, where I'm not a pseudoscientist, I'm not an artist, sort of pretending to make bad science. I'm not making pictures about it. If Valerie and I spent $50 million on a full force feedback haptic VR cave, right, with gloves, and we walked into a simulated game room and we touched this apple, right, that we might be able to make, we would all know it was fake. But if you and I went to Target and spent $5 and bought a plastic apple, it's a higher order of implementation than a $50 million or $1 billion simulation, because it resides in the same phenomenological space we do. So if anybody gets concerned or worried that the dean's all about digital, no. That's the short-term step, the simulation, before we get to emulation, which is when humans actually have the capacity to operate inside of the fabric of space-time and make work beyond our wildest imaginations, except for the fact we can imagine it, we know it. We get there, you don't need anything. Your body's like, oh my God, I recognize this. I know this better than my grandmother's voice. I know this better than my own voice, right? So you have those kinds of capacities that, as we challenge ourselves and we challenge our institutions, we challenge them in so many ways, socially, culturally, intellectually. How do they then, reflect the capacity of the human imagination?
Wow, I don't even know how to follow up except to say, hey, it's truly, as you're talking, I'm thinking of, and this is sci-fi. My mind goes back to being a kid, remembering this movie. I cannot recall the name of the movie, but it was a body that was ailing. And the scientists that decided to shrink themselves, be injected inside of this body.
Incredible journey.
The incredible, you remember it.
Yeah, of course.
And how the body became the universe.
Yeah.
How they shrank themselves. That within our bodies is this sort of all the properties of the universe. So no matter where you go, there you are. That's all there is to it. And Trenton Doyle Hancock, speaking of which, who is an individual who inhabits and has created this whole universe. I mean, he has created a mythology. So when we think about, the need to create these narratives, these myths, to make sense of worlds that we often don't understand. this was Trenton Doyle Hancock's way of doing that. And he had studied at UT Commerce at the time, which had people like Lee Baxter Davis, and out of that came Gary Panter, who, for those who don't know, created set designs for Pee-wee's Playhouse, Jordana Dean, Robin O'Neill, people who were really prolific in creating these mythologies, both in narratives and in the visual culture that would sort of emerge to support these very, very long and elaborate mythologies. And for him, it became the mythology of the mound and the story of the mound, which for him became this sort of ambiguous morality tales, right? I mean, it's the good versus evil, except when good is not always good. and evil is not always evil. So it was being raised as a Christian, as he would say, sitting at the feet of his grandfather, playing within the band of the church. I mean, hearing where mythology was sort of, it was embodied.
Absolutely.
It came, and he was one of those children who was sat down from a very early age and given a crayon and given a pencil. So he had been drawing this sort of hand-mind movement, this connection. He had been drawing for many, many years. So this exhibition called Skin and Bones was featured in 2014, and this is the Contemporary Arts Museum again in Houston, which is where Trenton also lives in Houston. So I had a chance to really sit with him and devise this exhibition. The great thing about living artists and working with living artists is that everything is really a collaboration. It's not me imposing an idea upon an artist. It's really creating a platform for those artists to really present themselves and present the whole arc and all of the things that have come to formulate their way of thinking. And so with this, we had some of the very earliest drawings that Trenton presented, and it was 20 years of those drawings, and it really focused on this very iconic mythology that he happened upon himself, which was this idea of the mound. And so it's presented in many different phases and movements, but this is the skin of the building, and of course the banner.
Yeah.
So.
Is there any more else?
No. I
you
think
would like
we've
to
been given the
explore?
5 minutes. So
5 minutes?
I want to.
We can take some questions.
Yes.
Okay.
So you want to take it away with this apparatus and how
Yeah.
this.
There's probably a better picture over there. As Valerie talks about these intimate cosmologies, right? And many artists, even in collaborative work, there's still a monastic element that we work through. And clearly, in the previous work that we saw, it's not fetishized, right? There are these complex narratives, and artists really, especially as you develop your practice, you will ask yourself almost, the most vexing questions, and it leads you to places that are very different if you're open than you might imagine. Whether it's fashion, whether it's painting, whether it's sculpture, whether it's music, whether it's performance, whether it's mixed reality, virtual reality, sensing and control systems, all of you, right? We are building, I was saying to Valerie earlier, she and I went to institutions where anything was possible, but you have to wink at each other and say, do you remember how impossible that was?
Right.
So now I'm responsible, and I know some of you are my students, and it's not always as easy as I would like to make it, but I'm responsible for building an institution where it's likely, anything is likely, and that's different than simply just being possible. So if you look at the projects that I showed you, you can probably even go back to something as simple as the Dutch masters or anyone. So many artists work with light. You could even say Thomas Kincaid works with light. But there's a huge difference between turning a light off and on or capturing it than actually making it, right? Now, making it could be that you just turn an electrical switch on, but that's pretty easy. What would it be for an artist to actually create light out of nowhere, and for that light to have meaning, right? And for it to have substance, and for it to be measurable by all instruments, all methods of science, yet however come from somewhere that no one could describe. No one understands where. So about 80 years ago, scientists discovered something called sonoluminescence. That means when you put sound waves in a liquid, you can actually crush a bubble of air fast enough that it gives off light. And they don't know why. They didn't know why. So I began becoming really interested in this. And generally, the scientists who work here on our campus and other campuses do it for what's called picoseconds. They do it like that, and then they measure it. And they're trying to figure out how the universe works. Well, I didn't want to do it for just a second. I wanted to do it 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. But I didn't want it to just simply happen. I wanted it to happen because. So what you have here is two loudspeakers. Let's just call them loudspeakers. And they produce a force field of sound in the shape of an hourglass. Can you imagine two cones coming together a little bit like a vise? And at the center of that vise, that pressure is so strong that I can split oxygen and hydrogen into a bubble, and it allows it to drift, and I catch it in the middle. And then I start crushing the radius of it at nearly the speed of light. What happens when I crush it at the speed of light, or almost right at it, about 99%, it reaches relativistic speeds in the outer edge of the water, and the air on the inside get out of phase with one another. They don't know where they are in space-time. They behave, if you have some basic science knowledge, they behave in ways that no one knows. The light that comes out of there is improbable. I can put it through what's called a photospectrometer and actually show you that it's a black body spectrum. Normally, if you were having light coming out of water, it must have an absorption line of hydrogen and oxygen or an emission line of hydrogen and oxygen. It's got to come from somewhere, but it's a black body spectrum. So I encode my voice into the sound field that crushes this bubble, and the light that's emitted is a star in a jar that no physicist, no scientist knows where it comes from, because it's actually light that's coming from nowhere that we really fully understand. So now, rather than reaching back 25 million years or 100 million years, humans are reaching into places and begetting things that we don't even know where our hands are going, but what's being brought back out. And that light is not just light, but it's actually emitting the words. So I allowed anyone, before Twitter, you would send basically 150 characters in sort of a short poem, and your poem would be the sound field, right, which would crush the bubble of air, and the light that would be emitted would be this star. And this is 1/50,000th of a second. And that's probably no bigger than the head of a pin. And that's at its largest radius before it collapses in on itself. So if an artist is going to do this, the proof of concept means that I don't make a star. All I have to do is make a single point of light. I don't paint it. I don't turn it on. I create it. It comes from somewhere that no one in the world knows where it comes from, but it's actually made of your voices, right? And it's begetting it, and it's real. And then if we go back, there's a stereo microscope that actually looks at all of this in real time. And video projection screens allow you to wear stereo 3D glasses, and you stand up and you walk into this space where this star in a jar has been constructed, and you essentially are there with it while it's being constructed. And anyone in the world can sort of tune in on the internet and hear the voices being spoken out of this light that no one knows where it comes from. That would be an example. So you can kind of see the arc of the few projects that I've shown you. There's many more that I do. But not too, in many ways, dissimilar from the artists who hold, I'll say, a philosophical orientation to, the performative. And there's different kinds of scale, not just large and small, but right, there's social scale. There are any number of scales that you and I could probably spend another hour talking about. But these were the examples that I wanted to talk about tonight with Valerie, and to talk about her work. I'm not sure, do we have?
I think that's it.
Yeah. Oh, no, there's one more.
Oh.
There's one of mine, and there's
Well,
one of
talk
yours, but
about-
let's answer some questions.
Yes, that's true. Okay.
Don't be shy.
That was a large public artwork you did.
Yes.
Yes.
This was a large public piece for the
Olympics. Yeah.
not for the Olympics. This one was for the European Capital of Culture. When you were a kid and you were told no two snowflakes are alike, that's true. But if you take water and you purify it enough, you can erase its memory and it doesn't know how to freeze. That's how we make semiconductors, right? That's how we make, biotech. So I took ice core samples from the last glacial maximum that covered all of North America 20,000 years ago, and I recreated exact moments in time. So they're not 20,000 years old, they're 20,000 years ago. And because the science involved in it means that they are absolutely accurate copies of a moment in time that no longer exists. So if I can reach back in time, reach into scale, right now we're actually recreating time that no longer exists, and we can actually do it right here in front. And it was really designed, if you think of it this way, it sounds really hubristic for your dean to say, oh, I just cloned a glacier. No big deal. But it's more hubristic for humans to require an artist to actually clone a glacier because we are damaging our environment, right? So badly that they're receding so rapidly and disappearing that we have to do something as foolhardy as actually clone one to make the point about the fact that they're disappearing.
Yeah.
Right? So that's sort of, this was a large public piece, and I know that Valerie has, we have so many projects and so much work. And we could go on for a while because I think we've hit a stride.
We've hit a stride.
Yes.
We'll do this again.
Yeah, we'll do it again.
Yeah.
Do you guys have questions? Does anybody have questions?
And you should, yeah.
Shawn, through your work in particular, you talked a lot about like the light and the engineering that goes behind it and all the conceptual thinking math things. But you mentioned that the voices are a large part of the sound. And how do you pick the sound? Your voice, others' voices, why not different animal sounds? I mean, that's something more easily understandable for an audience.
So when I did the particle levitation, that piece, I won't say it was about me, but it really is, I won't say it's my, form of worship of God, but in essence, you're trying to touch you're trying to touch something beyond yourself, others, etc. And I really felt that I owed it to actually write the words myself and to speak those to bring this thing into its shape. The Altamira, which is the one that occurs in the mind's eye, I simply chose no voice simply because there was no greater voice than that which we all share. It was a common language, right? The fact that the brain and the body and the universe all share a common language, and we all automatically, I don't even need to do anything, it's all there. It's all, fully there. Now, in Eon, it wasn't my voice at all. I simply allowed anyone in the world through the internet to come to the site, and their spoken words would generate the light and would generate the not only the words that created the light, but the words that came out of the light. These projects take about 5 years a piece, a lot of work, as you can imagine, when on top of being an executive. And I would simply say that I'm not quite at the place of universal language yet because I have so many colleagues that, in many ways, that I am in intellectual communion with. So I've spent a lot of my career reaching out to medicine, business, engineering, and not because I don't like my arts colleagues, but simply because we have this space, we have this flirtation since the Renaissance that we operate.
I was about to say, there are moments in time where you have the intersection of science. You would not have a Leonardo without this sense of exploring the body and exploring the heavens. To them, Da Vinci, they were one and the same, that exploration. So it's fine, and you find many artists like Dario Robledo,
absolutely,
who are reaching out to heart specialists.
Yes.
Dr. Fraser and he have been working on this amazing project, really looking at the heavens and space dust and meteors and finding ways in which music and aspects of the universe intersect. I mean, we're all reaching in these various ways, and artists have these various facets of how they move through the world. So it's
I would also say, and it's not a defensiveness, right? I think, you know, you get a very thick skin being a dean for as many years as I have. But there is a, I don't want to say, I'm trying to come, what I want to come to is like sort of a singular point for you. I don't want to say it would be arbitrary for me to, you know, choose a monkey or a dog or a cat, right? You understand what I mean? That there is an overarching desire in many ways to find, commonality, shared languages that allow us to communicate, to build a more verdant world. And so in my more recent work, it's become much more grounded in being human and in the emergency and the urgency of what it really means to be that, and of investing sort of in many ways my career the last 7 or 8 years primarily in public research universities, which have a strong focus on social justice and on inclusive excellence, on interdisciplinarity, right? Sort of all of these places where we can come together rather than places that sort of, take us apart. And you'll find that, as a dean, I could probably answer you on all kinds of stuff with like unerring accuracy, but when it comes to your art, right? No matter how, let's say how complicated this looks, I am probably among all the art that Valerie showed, I am the single most primitive of all of them. Because I'm simply going into a space that we've not ever been in, leaving marks that we don't really know how they perform, other than just simply to claim we are here. We mean something. We mean no harm. We want to embrace, right? We want to share. And it's as simple as that. So I am the most primitive of any of my faculty. Because the space that I'm interested in occupying, there's no cardinal directions. There's no there until I come out of the I'm the progeny of many generations, but there's not a lot of evidence yet.
Well, I think for artists it's the same. I think securing one's imprint. Oftentimes it will engage pushing against this wall of history and finding a way to have some singularity within that long arc of painting. How do you distinguish oneself? It's almost like, how do you find the uniqueness of your own fingerprint? How do you make that visible? How do you show that to the world? Your singularity. What do you contribute that differentiates yourself from something that has happened? I think artists are also grappling. They have this whole history to push against. So in many ways, you're right. The history is there, but it becomes the chaos of which you try to distinguish one singular voice above all of the chaos.
And one of the things that we didn't mention, I want to get to your question because I saw your hand, and why I'm not a racialized minority, I can say that, coming from the discipline that I come from, was not much beloved in the canon, right, of the arts, and I find it so interesting, right? That you and I are both sitting here, that you would have, the dean of the #1 art school trained as a scientist and engineer, right? And, probably an anathema, if not apostate or blasphemous to, many of the sort of sculptural canons that I might have come out of. And, similarly, as we sort of try to construct, meaning out of not, there's no true parallel in sort of the notion of marginalization, but a lot of you may stake territory out that has never been experienced before, and you're up against that wall of history. You're up against many things, and part of our joy and our desire with the institutions that we have is to find methods, mechanisms to support you to achieve that. I want to get to the other question. I think what happens is I'm in my heart now. I'm in a very different space where language doesn't always operate the same way. You feel your way through.
We have time for one more.
Yeah. And I think there's...
I have 3 kids, and one of the more relatable things that you said, not an artist or a scientist, I'm a writer, was that the longer you've had kids is the more animal you become. That really piqued my interest in, and I wondered, both of you, it sounded like that was a shared opinion, so I just was curious, both of you, how has that changed your careers or who you are? I just thought that was a fascinating comment.
Well, you stated it.
Okay.
So you start.
I'll start. Valerie talked about sort of the esoteric nature of what it is that we do. And there's a lot of you in your practices, no matter how good you get at talking about it, it's still your own universe. So often what I find is that when we can down convert what we do into French critical theory, German critical theory, et cetera, it's better for artists if we operate actually in the language of creation. So we become fluent with each other's sort of bodies of knowledge. And in this sort of rarefied space, so I had been at many years at UC Berkeley, at MIT, at Ann Arbor, like all of the top 10 ranked universities in the world, and you live in a rarefied atmosphere. It's not an atmosphere of privilege. You earn your place there because you're required, if you're tenured in most of those institutions, you must make history.
Produce, yeah.
And you must document that, right? And they know enough about history, the folks around you, to say that's never been done before, or it's been done a lot before, and you don't get to do that. What I found becoming a dad, and if any of you are parents, they hand you a baby in the hospital. There's no owner's manual, there's nothing. They hand you this, and you automatically start neurally remodeling. You neurally remodel, and it happens almost overnight. These things happen to you, these extraordinary things. And then the questions that you have that resided in the space primarily of the esoteric, right? And of these, how far of a human horizon can I possibly reach and leave a mark that could last to the end, in eternity, right? Not because I want to be God, because I want to touch the face of God and just say, I am here, right? But when you have a child, something happens, or it happened to me, and I think when we were talking downstairs. And so I made not an abrupt, but a very purposeful, intentional decision to move my career into institutions that I thought were more vital. And we're now getting around to the question that was ultimately asked, how did we end up here? If you're going to have the conversation that she and I want to have, where do you start that? And for me, as a dean of an art school, you cannot start that at the 46th ranked art school. You must start in the top 1, 2, or 3, right? It's hard. Then you have to you're more like a venture capitalist at this point. You need a strong state who yields, candidates for federal office, strong federal courts, circuit courts. You probably will be better off in a state capital. You understand what I mean? Because the influence of what you're doing, right? Then you add on top of it, and we can criticize Jefferson upside down and backwards, take him to the woodshed, but ultimately he started the great experiment, which is part of the, US experiment in education, post-secondary education. And then you're in the epicenter of civil rights. I could go on and on and on. If Richmond was a stock, right? If it was something like that, I would simply say bye, 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 because you have these organizations that are now reaching fruition. You have a collective community that's driving something that if I lived in San Francisco during .com, I lived in Seattle before it went crazy and when it went crazy. I smell it. I know what it looks like. And I want to be in an organization that edifies what it means to be human and want to build more verdant worlds for my son, for your son, for all of us. And I don't need to be in another location. I need to be in a place where we can have that conversation and do something that really, frankly, can't be done anywhere else. So that's sort of that's the transformation. So no need to be anywhere else but here.
I would concur with all of that. I mean, when I was hired with this mandate to expand a narrative. And not only to expand it, but to be given the resources and the capital to do it. and to be able to do it in a thoughtful environment, an environment which has become such a fabric of the society, this community. It is an opportunity to affect the way people talk about art and who makes art and what the various origins and histories are. And to be able to make the connections within an encyclopedic museum is fairly extraordinary. And the history about race and how and when it begins it does not begin with the Confederacy. Let's just be clear. Next year will be the celebration of 400 years of black bodies being on the soil. So when you want to talk about black bodies, you have to really go all the way back. And it provides a very unique framework to begin to look at these histories in a very interesting way. It's a wonderful place to do that, to do it within the spectrum. We keep coming back to arcs, and the arc of history, bodies really in the Americas. I mean, there were people here when Europeans came. It was, when Europe came, there were Native Americans here. So when you talk about the displacement and the erasure and how we are slowly but surely coming to reconcile our experiences as Americans, there's no place better to have that conversation than right here in Richmond. And there's such a progressive ideology.
Yes.
There's such a willingness to have the conversation, maybe a discomfort, but a willingness to know that we have to, at points in times, come to the realization that our history is fraught, that our lack of civility come out of firmly held ideals that are facets of America, but not the whole of America. And so it's a very unique and very interesting moment to be here. So.